everyone. I'm Erin Hardig, Z-Prime's lead research analyst. I'm in Washington, D.C. at the Grid Connects conference. I'm joined by Steve Hauser, CEO of Gridwise Alliance. How are you, Steve?
I'm good. The conference is nearing an end, and so it's always nice to see the end near.
It is. We put on a few conferences ourselves, so I know how you feel on the last day. Can you talk about what the objective is for Grid Connects and the conference itself?
Absolutely. So the Gridwise Alliance is an organization, it's a nonprofit organization. It's been around 15 years. We try to bring together stakeholders from around the industry that represent different perspectives. So whether it's state regulators or governors' energy offices or utilities, rural electric co-ops, large IOUs, they all have different perspectives on these issues of what's changing the industry. And so the Alliance was structured to try to represent all those perspectives. When we looked at doing a conference like Grid Connects, the purpose was also to bring together those different perspectives. Understanding that, not to be too flip, but it sort of takes a village to make this happen, right? So all of us have some role in helping the industry to change in the way that we've been talking about during the conference. And so we try our best to represent those perspectives. The other thing we try to do is not just look at what's happened in the industry over the last few years, because there's been a lot of changes, but there's a lot of conferences that talk about that. So what we try to do is anticipate what changes are about to happen. So whether it's talking about open source information, distributed resources, the convergence of transmission distribution, we look at, okay, these things are starting to happen. They maybe are gaining momentum. They're happening more or faster than maybe we even thought they were going to. So we try to focus on those issues and then try to understand, so given those changes that are about to happen or are starting to happen much more rapidly, what are the issues that we really need to be aware of as an industry to kind of help anticipate what needs to happen to make those the transformation, if you will, happen more easily.
One thing that's being talked a lot about at the event and used in some of the presentations I've been seeing is the Grid Modernization Index. Can you tell us about what the Grid Modernization Index is and what was looking to be achieved by continuing to do the Grid Modernization Index? Because this isn't the first year it's been out.
That's right. So we started it about 5 years ago, and we were faced with this challenge. We've done a lot of work at the federal level, right? So at the federal level, you're trying to look at issues that kind of cross-cut everyone across the country. But when you start to look at what's happening at the state and local level, there's 50 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, even Guam, right, if you will. So there's these different jurisdictions, each of which have their own issues, own constraints. Just a simple example is Florida and the Gulf Coast worry a lot about hurricanes. Colorado, we don't worry about hurricanes, right? We might have a snowstorm once in a while. California is worried about wildfires, right? Especially right now. The Northwest is worried about earthquakes. Alaska's, just had this earthquake last week. So each of these states have a different perspective on what's important and what's valued. So when we created Grid Modernization Index, we looked at over 100 different factors that affect the modernization of the grid that essentially cross-cuts every jurisdiction. These are characteristics that we think are important no matter what state you're in, no matter what city you're in. And so each year we try to collect data from from the different states, different utilities across the country in terms of these different factors, and then we score them and rank the scores, right? So the scores, and forgive me if I don't know exact scores off the top of my head, but the newest ranking that came out yesterday has California at the top, which they're always at the top, and I think their score was 82 out of 100, right? About 20 or 25 states score kind of at 40 or 45 and above, right? So half the states, let's say, are kind of in the 50 to above range. But the important thing with this newest one, and we do this every year, we try to update, any changes that have happened during the year, and then we rescore and repost the scores. And what's particularly encouraging is that we see scores going up every year. Not universally true, and I won't name states whose scores either didn't go up or might have dropped a point or two, but generally the scores in the states are going up. We're seeing progress across the board, and even the states that are scoring lower in the 25, 30 range are starting to take this much more seriously. And I think we'll see that over the next 2 or 3 years, we'll see scores from even those states start to climb.
And you, yesterday during the reception, you recognized a few states. You gave them awards given their score on the Grid Modernization Index. California was one, I believe Illinois was another, but there are a few others. What were some of those other awards?
Yeah, so we've never given awards before, but we increasingly felt like it was important to recognize some of the particularly innovative things going on. Illinois and California, as you said, we awarded them, we call it our Leadership Award. They've consistently been at the top. They tend to score higher than any of the other states by, several points, let's say. So clearly they're leaders, and in very different ways. California has a different approach than Illinois for lots of different reasons. But their scores are very similar because they're accomplishing a lot of the same things, even though they've taken different approaches. What we also did was then gave award to 2 other states for what we called outstanding progress. And this was not just for 2018, but kind of looking across the last 2 or 3 years, which states have really notably improved, done some very significant things, and made some changes that are starting to really mature, right? And, we looked at probably a dozen different states that have clearly made progress. But we picked Ohio and we picked Rhode Island, even though they're not necessarily scoring high, they're not in the top 10, let's say, of states, but they've significantly improved over the last couple of years. And so we wanted to acknowledge the fact that they're working really hard to make these changes. And of course, the changes that we've seen the last couple of years will now result in their scores continuing to go up, I would expect. And so we'll definitely see them go up more towards the top 10 probably over the next year or two.
Well, I think it's great to recognize these other states that maybe aren't the leaders, like you said. People typically associate kind of this innovation with California, right, with Chicago and Illinois, but I think it's great to see that other states are also moving, maybe not at the pace that these leaders are, but they're still moving forward. Right. We're wrapping up the conference. Mm-hmm. Some people were not fortunate enough to attend. What would you say are some of the key takeaways of the conference for those people who weren't able to attend?
Well, it's a little bit like last year. I mean, I won't talk about last year so much, but last year it was like, wow, there's some surprises here. And this year, maybe not quite as many surprises, but still some surprises. So what sticks out in my mind is the panel on electrified transportation, which was focused really on public transportation and buses. And if you listen to the folks on that panel talk, this is happening very fast, right? And has changed very fast. It's things that wouldn't have been taking place 2 years ago, now are taking place, and are not only taking place, but are rapidly changing, right? Where cities are committing to 100% electric vehicles in 5 years. And that's going to certainly have a big impact on the grid, and that was the purpose of the panel, was to not just talk about the buses, which is cool, but to actually talk about the fact that it'll have a big impact on how the utilities manage that infrastructure, how those buses get charged, when they get charged, and all that kind of stuff. So that was one of the panels. We had some keynotes that I thought were really impressive. I've known Lawrence Schmidt for many years. He is now the head of all of the transmission companies in Europe. Huge job. We almost literally don't have that type of a person here in the US, but if you look at across all of Europe, their system is roughly the same size as our grid, if you will, in terms of how many kilowatt hours and kilowatts and how many people are served. It's not all that different. So he heads up all of that, right? And he was here speaking this morning, and Europe is just moving very fast in terms of how they're changing how they're operating their grid, partly because they're accommodating a lot more wind and solar in terms of percentage than we are, so it's changing the nature of their grid. They're going to adopt electric vehicles on a pace that's probably faster than we are. So I really like that. And then the last one I would probably point out is Jonathan Salk, which you mentioned earlier. And, here's an older guy, clearly, retired. But his father was Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine. But they wrote a book a few years ago, and then they've recently updated it and re-released this book. And he talked so much about how the changes that are happening in the electricity sector are actually just a small indicator of changes that are happening across our society and across the globe. And so that we should not, this is my interpretation of what I heard from him, it's like, let's not get so disheartened that it's just us that are facing these changes, but that it's really a massive change that we're having to go through as society. And it's something we have to be conscious of because we're the ones that are sort of creating what that future is going to look like even right now. Some of the decisions we're making are going to be really important to what our world looks like for our kids and grandkids. So
right, he had that sigmoid curve, and I think one of the biggest takeaways from that presentation, at least for myself, is he pointed out that this change is actually part of a natural progression. Mm-hmm. It's not something that we need to sit here and all freak out about, but this is actually something that's very natural, and change is going to come and go, and that's just what happens. But
right, and I would say too, one of the takeaways, at least I was going to tell my kids when I get home, is that some of the scary things we see happening on the political front these days may be just a way for them to try to hold on to the past and not address the future. And when you think about it that way, it doesn't seem quite maybe as bad as it does some days when you're just looking at what's going on in the world. But
well, thank you for having us at the conference.
You're welcome.
Enjoyed all of the sessions. I think they're really high quality, great content. And I look forward to next year.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Erin.